Recording in progress.
I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. Please be seated. On a sweltering August day in 1965, 29 protesters, black and white, old and young, from all over the country, made their way to Fort Deposit, Alabama, a small town south of Montgomery, in order to picket the whites-only stores that dominated the downtown. Among that group of protesters were members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the group chaired by the late Congressman John Lewis. And alongside them was a 26-year-old white seminarian from Keene, New Hampshire, Jonathan Myrick Daniels. Daniels and his fellow protesters would be arrested that day. They were held for 6 days in the jail of a nearby town, and finally released with no way to return home or to regroup with their fellow activists. And it was at that point, there on the streets of Haynesville, Alabama, that everything would change for Jonathan Myrick Daniels. He and 3 other of the protesters, 2 black women, including a 17-year-old Ruby Sales, and a white Catholic priest, walked together to a nearby general store to buy something cold to drink. And though that store was known for being accepting and welcoming of non-white people, when the group approached the doors, they found them blocked by a deputy holding a shotgun. The deputy raised his weapon at the group, put his finger to the trigger, and fired. In the process, Jonathan Daniels pushed Ruby Sales down to the ground, saving her, but leaving him open to the full force of the shot. He died instantly, but in the process managed to save Ruby's life and the lives of the other 2 with them. Jonathan Daniels' path to that moment in rural Alabama was not a straightforward one. Born in Keene, New Hampshire, to Congregationalist parents, Daniels considered going into ministry at a young age. But after a crisis of faith in college at the Virginia Military Institute, he found his life drifting in other directions. But in time, he would come back to his faith just a few years later, after stepping into an Episcopal church in Boston, where he was just begun a graduate program in English literature. That moment would have such a profound effect on him, of bringing him back to his faith, to that core of who he was, to his sense of God's presence in his life, that he would eventually drop out of that graduate program in order to enroll at an Episcopal seminary just down the road, with hopes of one day being ordained a priest. And it was during that time in seminary that Daniels first heard the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak. At that time, Dr. King was asking clergy from all denominations and all over the country to join the movement for civil rights, to join in the march from Selma to Montgomery, to demand those rights. Something about that call took hold of Daniels. It lodged itself deep within him. And so what began as a weekend trip down to Selma turned first into a weeks-long involvement with the movement. And then, after a brief return north to finish his coursework for the semester, Jonathan Daniels would return to Alabama to commit himself fully to the movement, to help integrate public spaces in the wake of the passage of the Voting Rights Act. He put everything else on hold: family, ordination, finishing his coursework, to be a part of that movement. he heard God speaking to him, calling out to him through the words of Dr. King. And he responded. For him, his involvement in the civil rights movement was fundamentally an act of faith, something that he had to do for God and for the people suffering under the oppressive weight of segregation. In both our Old Testament and Gospel readings today, we hear parallel call stories. Two stories of people being spoken to and called by God to follow and to go somewhere where they could not have foreseen themselves ever going. In our Old Testament lesson from Genesis, we hear the beginning of the story of Abram, who would later become Abraham. God speaks to Abram, telling him to leave the land of his ancestors so that God may lead him to a new land. And Abram prepares to make the journey that God will lead him on. He gathers all of his possessions together, brings his family together, and sets out for that unknown land that God would reveal to him when the time was right. By doing so, Abram and his family leave behind all that is familiar, comfortable, safe, secure, all that they have known, all that has provided for them, in order to pursue this ill-defined goal and embark on a journey whose ending they could not foresee. As we hear Paul describe it in his letter to the Romans, this willingness to leave behind homeland and put trust in God wherever God was leading Abram is an ultimate act of faith. All Abram had to go on was this promise that wherever he went, God's blessing would go with him. It's easy for me to imagine Abraham making this list of pros and cons of this proposition, and just how lengthy that cons list would be. At the end of the day, there was nothing reasonable about that decision. To look at this list of every reason not to go, and on the other side simply have promise of blessing. But Abraham chose this forced displacement, this forced exile into a new and unknown land because of his faith. And that is the only reason that that choice makes any sense. The only reason that decision makes sense is because of a radical and consuming trust that God would provide for him, and that God's promises would hold true and would not leave him wanting, despite all the evidence and all the reasons to the contrary. It is through faith and faith alone that Abraham was able to hope against hope and leave his homeland for a future that only God could know. Our gospel reading begins with a similar story. Jesus is walking through the Judean countryside when he encounters a man called Matthew, a tax collector sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus says to him, and Matthew follows. Just like that, one sentence. He gets up from his booth. I can imagine his papers, his abacus, all of the things he was using to keep tally and total of the taxes he had taken in that day, still sitting right where they had been. And he follows after Jesus. He leaves everything behind, his career and all the security it brings, his homeland and whatever family he may have. He veers off the path that he had been walking on for years to step into uncharted territory. Like Abram, he leaves so much behind in order to follow the call, having no idea where it would lead or what would be demanded of him. There's no justification for the choice he makes except by faith. Through these biblical stories, we see a pattern emerging. There are times when God calls God's people to leave behind the safety, comfort, and security of what is known and familiar in order to follow a new call, a new path, to step out onto a new journey with no certainty of where it will lead or what they will encounter along the way. The only source of hope on that new path, the only reason to keep going down it, is that assurance that God's blessing will go with them. For our gospel writer, and in Paul's account of Abraham, that is the pattern of discipleship. A willingness to hear God's call and to go where it leads, not getting caught up in that lengthy list of cons and the shorter list of pros, and the reasons why not. That willingness comes from that leap of faith, from trusting that God's blessings await on the other side of that choice, and that those blessings, that promise of God's enduring presence with us, is enough. Through all the uncertainty, through all our inability to see what lies ahead of us, that act of faith is believing that God's presence, that God's love, that God's guidance will be enough. The calling of Jonathan Myrick Daniels is a call story in that same mold. He heard God's call speaking to him through the voice of Reverend Dr. King, and he followed. He left his home, the path that he was on, the career that lay ahead of him, the expectations of the great things he would go on to do, in order to go to the exact place that God called him, the land that God would show him, in order to do what was necessary. He paid a tremendous price for following that call. But I can't help but think that in those last moments, he experienced God's blessing, just as him giving his life was truly a blessing to those other three with him, and just as his life and witness continue to be a blessing to all who hear and know his name and story. I've been blessed in my life to have met a few people who have truly followed God's call in this sort of radical and uncompromising way. I think of Dr. Jonathan Irlew, who was the father of a college friend of mine. He was someone who graduated from Harvard Medical School, was given a prestigious research position, was on a fast track to serve on the faculty at Harvard, to become a leading researcher in the field of internal medicine, who had this successful career laid out ahead of him, who would climb the ladder in the medical field, be able to retire comfortably someday, and live, by all means, a good and productive life. But at some point in that work, in that research position, he became dismayed over how his work felt detached from the reasons he got into medicine to begin with, to bring health and healing to the lives of actual people in real situations. So feeling this discontent, Dr. Irlew signed up for a 2-year rotation, working in a hospital on the Navajo Reservation in Gallup, New Mexico. Assuming that he would serve out those 2 years, that he would feel justified by his great work there, and that he would return to Boston recharged and recommitted to his career trajectory. 30-something years later, he's still in that hospital in Gallup, New Mexico. That work has brought him to the front lines of rising HIV infections on the reservation throughout the early 2000s. He was in that same hospital throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, having to help direct and guide the response of this hospital and of that Indian Health Services, who were hit incredibly hard later in the summer of 2020 and into 2021. He's been there for those 30 years, seeing the daily struggles of the thousands of patients both native and non-native, who he's cared for over those many years. He was called to that hospital in Gallup, New Mexico, not knowing what he would find. He left behind the track that he had been on to go to an unknown land. Following that call has led him to a life that he could never have foreseen for himself. But because he acted out of faith and not by all the reasons not to do something, Dr. Irelu has become a blessing to the people of Gallup. And I imagine that he himself has been blessed by that work he has been given to do and all the people who he has encountered along the way. The through line that connects each of these stories, Jonathan Daniels, Abraham, Matthew, Dr. Irelu, is that they took a risk. They acted out of their deep conviction and faith instead of all the reasons not to do something. And as a result, their lives have become blessings for others, and they themselves have been blessed. The path of discipleship is not an easy one. It requires much of those who wish to follow Christ. But most of all, it requires a willingness in both big and small things to act by faith, to make choices that defy reason, expectations, and social norms in order to go where God is calling. The hope against hope of the gospel is that making those decisions will not disappoint us. They will not leave us wanting. But that when we go where God calls us, God goes with us. God's blessings accompany us each step of the way, and we carry those blessings with us everywhere we go and to everyone whom we meet along the way. So my prayer for all of us is that we may have something of the faith of Abram, of Jonathan Daniels, of Matthew, of Dr. Irelu, to follow God's call where it leads. May we be willing to leave behind what is easy, safe, and comfortable in order to go to that country where God will show us, trusting that God's blessings go with us, that by our faith we will be blessed, and by our faith we will be a blessing. Amen.